So I'm John Reynolds, and if there was any doubt, I work for IBM. This is our standard disclaimer. That's just what we do. So what I want to talk about today is data-centric BPM. And there has been a lot written about data-centric BPM over the past few years. Several papers have come out. Several products are incorporating aspects of data-centric BPM. But what I want to do today
I'm in the middle of an event.
is I want to reintroduce data-centric BPM as something that can actually address a problem that we all have, those of us who actually implement solutions. And so I want to show you that by having both process and data as the basic building blocks of your solutions, that we're going to get a lot of advantages to this. And to introduce this, and I think this is great today, given some of our presentations earlier today, is I'd like to introduce the analogy between a process that's running in production and the live performance of a play. As we've seen this morning, unscripted things happen when you're live, right? So if you think of a play defines a story, it has scenes, it has characters, and those are all composed by the author, by the playwright. Now, analogous on the process side, the process modeler creates the activities, the flows, you name it. But one thing that an author cannot deal with is these unscripted things that happen while the play is being performed, while the process is being executed in production. So it would be ridiculous for us as process authors to try to handle these things. We can anticipate, an actor might trip, a prop may break, there might be a heckler in the audience, like that one back there. The author doesn't deal with that. So what do we need to do? Well, what we need to do is we need to provide capabilities in our systems so that at runtime, when something unscripted happens, that a knowledge worker can come in and deal with that unscripted thing. All right, but I'm talking about data. So how did I get there? Well, what we find is to deal with these unscripted things, there's additional work that has to be done, and this additional work today is invisible. It happens all the time. You go into any office, any process that's going on, smooth running office, and then all of a sudden there's a little disturbance in the force in the back. And what you find is that a knowledge worker comes in and deals with the problem. And we've looked at this, and most of the times when a knowledge worker comes in and deals with an unscripted problem, what they're actually doing is they're interacting with the data. They're interacting with the business entities that make up the process. So what we find is one of the benefits of data-centric BPM is if we do this properly, we're also providing a mechanism so that when these things that you did not script happen, that a knowledge worker has the tools to come in and interact directly with the business entities to basically deal with the unexpected thing and get back on the script. Now, the data that we're dealing with is actually business entities, all right? We've had support for data in BPM forever, right? But the reality is, the question here is not which came first. No, this is, think about this, this is a business entity at one phase of its life cycle and at another phase of its life cycle. When something happens and I need to interact directly with this in an unscripted way, it matters which life cycle phase it's in, okay? And this is why having data being a first-class citizen in your processes is extremely important, and modeling the data, modeling the life cycles of the data, and the rules that are associated for the various different life cycles, because there's things you can do with an egg that you'd never want to do with a chicken, and vice versa, okay? So this is my obligatory canned demo because I don't like live things either. So we've taken our complex data that we already have, and we've added the ability to turn important business objects into what we call managed data. If it's a managed data, then you're allowed to define as many phases of the life cycle of the object as makes sense. There may be a few, there may be a lot. In addition, we can define on every field various different rules. So for example, data access rules. Who can see this data? Who can modify this data? Who can delete this data? We also have audit rules. We also have validation rules. You'll notice that for each phase, I can define a different rule, because that's the point of the lifecycle phase. As you're in a different phase applied to the business entity itself. And then finally, you see up here, I can modify my rules based upon the role of the business person who's interacting with that object, because that also affects the rules. So your end result, and now I'm back to slideware, is a lifecycle diagram of your business entity itself. And your process, when you're modeling, interacts with this modeled data. You'll notice we also have ad hoc activities that are defined on the data itself. For example, you might have an ad hoc activity to move something back to a previous lifecycle phase. That might be a good example. And basically, when you're talking to the business people, this is the way they think. They think about their entities in this way. So combining this with process is quite helpful. So once again, we have rules that are defined for each lifecycle phase, for every field. We have various different rules. And among these rules, we have actions. So we'll be able to define thresholds values, for example, that would emit an event. Now, that's an expected thing, and that works in your model exactly the same way as today if you have events coming from an ECM system, document events. These are much finer grained level. So this helps you basically build your process around the data realities. Because, for example, let's say you're processing a claim. The claim object will probably stay the same even if your process changes. And its rules and its life cycles and its phases really help the business people to engage. So, but I said this was real. I said this wasn't phony. BPM is not a system of record, and we are not suggesting that BPM become a system of record. For this to really work, it has to connect to the real data. So what we're working on at IBM is something with the lovely name of the Managed Data Interface. Now, simplicity is key for the implementation of BPM projects. We have to make things simple. And as you've seen today, when we go from BPMN to BPMN2, we've added a lot of complexity that kind of annoys some people, right? Well, we don't want to do that here. So basically, think of this as a facade. It's a facade between the business representation of the data and the actual integrations that are done so that you can connect to this data that's out there in your systems of record. Okay? Now, this works out for a very nice separation of concerns. And this, I think, is a guide to all of us in our tooling. The tooling that these business people want for interacting with the data in their processes are very different than the tooling that our IT traditional programmers, full-time integration experts want for setting up those integrations. So this managed data interface, by providing that facade, each party gets to work on the side of the facade that they're most comfortable, and we can tailor the tools to that particular audience. So I think that's something that you're going to see. You know, we've worked with clients who basically, they want one model, but they want that model to be viewed by everybody from their CEO to their integration developers. And you can imagine the visualization is very different for each of those audiences. So this is a step in that direction. Now, I said that this was going to help you when you need to deal with something unscripted, when you need to ad-lib something, when you need to ad-lib your lines. And so I'm going to take you through a scenario of how this will help you. So when you become aware that something has happened, we now have Lucene-based full-text search across all of our processes, all of our instances, and all of our data. So the knowledge worker will use their experience to basically try to find, okay, this unscripted thing happened. What processes does it relate to? They'll use the search facility to get them to a list that provides more context. Now, once again, we're trying to make it so that a knowledge worker will do this unscripted work inside our tool so that we can capture that work rather than just pick up the phone and deal with it, and then we don't know it happened, right? So quickly getting to the things that are affected by this unexpected event, that's very important. Now, once we get there, we can drill down into the user interface, either at the process instance level or perhaps for a specific task. Now, our user interface layer works in conjunction with our data management layer so that all of the rules that were defined on the data are honored by this screen. Now, this is pretty darn good because often we have multiple screens that are looking at the same business entities. And today in our tooling, we can do this, but we have to reproduce those rules on each screen. Now, the user interface layer is working in conjunction with the data management layer to honor those rules in that central place, which is really where they belong. So for example, there's data that I can just see in my role. Sorry. There's data that I can modify in my role. And also over here, you can see there are actions that I can take for my role. Now, collaboration is extremely important, particularly when you're trying to deal with an unscripted event. I may have to rope in a whole bunch of people in order to resolve this, in order to do my improvisation. With what we already have in our product, I can collaborate on this screen. I can basically share this task with somebody else. When they pull it up, it's not screen sharing. They're seeing this user interface rendered based on their role. So that combination of rendering the screens based on the role of the participant means I can collaborate safely. I don't have to worry that somebody is going to see that social security number they're not supposed to see, right? And I don't have to worry that I'm going to expose an interface to them that allows them to do an action that they're not authorized to do. So once again, we want to make it quick and easy for them to deal with this unscripted thing from within the tooling so we can capture it, but we need to make sure that it's safe also. So that's why the business entity rules and honoring them across all of your solutions is very important. Now, this makes sense so far when I'm collaborating with you to deal with something unscripted. But the fact is that we're usually dealing with business entities that are very important across the enterprise, right? They're being used by other processes. They're being used by other activities. So awareness is very important. And once again, conjunction of the user interface layer and the data management layer, notifications will go out to anybody who's looking at any screen that is dealing with this business entity that I'm doing some unscripted work on. Okay? Now you noticed my demo wasn't all that exciting because we do not want to put the onus on the process designer for these sorts of things. This is more an implementation reality check thing. The reason why a lot of projects bog down when they get into the implementation phase, that's my background, is building these projects, is that you get to things like this that are unstructured and unexpected, and you have to have very clever programmers and expend a lot of effort to implement these sorts of things. And that's why IBM keeps investing in a user interface layer for BPM. And that's why we'll be investing in this area. It's not that you can't do these things today, but it will be much easier to do these things once we've baked these things in and they're there out of the box. And I've seen very similar things from a lot of other players in the field. So I think you're going to see this across the industry. So I think that shows that by adding data as a first-class item into your BPMS system has now made it much easier for you to deal with unscripted things, right? It makes it much easier for you to deal with that thing that happens once in a blue moon, and it wasn't worth baking that into your model. But I want to suggest this. Our solutions today, by and large, are too brittle. We do our modeling, we do our implementation project, we deploy, right? We're doing everything in the world so that we as the people who are implementing the processes can respond to change as quickly as possible. But there will always be a lag between the change in the business conditions and us being able to deploy something new. Now, by providing our knowledge workers with this ability to ad-lib their lines, think of how many times you've seen a play where the ad-lib line was actually funny and made it better, and they started working that into the next performances. That's really what we need to get to. We need to be able to capture those things, get them back into our models. But in the meantime, we must, at runtime, give tools to our knowledge workers so that they can cope with change, right? Because you have no option. If they're not able to do this within the system, they stop using the system. And I've seen that happen time and time and time again. So when the unscripted becomes the norm, you must have these mechanisms so that the knowledge worker can break out of your script, do what's necessary, and get the show back on the road. That's an absolute requirement. And that's one aspect of Data-Centric BPM that I think is going to be a big boost for us in terms of adoption. I mentioned this before. Because we're now doing this work within our systems, we're now able to track this work. We're now able to monitor this work. And we'll be able to feed this work back into our analysis so that when it is time for you to put that in the script, you have the data there from actual execution so that you can see how was this actually dealt with in the real world, and was that good enough? And you might find, in some cases, well, we'll just leave it unscripted and let them handle it. And you might find other times that it makes sense to bake that back into your solution. So, who could ask for anything more? Data and process together. I think this is a very natural idea for those of us who have programming backgrounds. I mean, process and data, that's what it's all about. And rules, of course. And so really, this is a very strong direction for us at IBM. This is something that, we've done the research, we've been talking about it for a long time. But I think particularly now, it's time to work towards bringing this to the market. So that was very quick. I wanted to put up this lovely quote from some of my colleagues at IBM Research. Somebody asked me, do we actually pay attention to the folks at IBM Research? And yes, we do. It takes us a while, but this is really the next thing for us from IBM. So, questions, comments?